Oh, hey guys, it's good to see you again. Let's talk some more about the artistic principles of visual effects. If you missed the first video on gameplay, I recommend you check that out first before going on to this one, or not if you're more interested in shapes instead. So, in talking about shapes as an artistic principle of effects, I like to think of them as the primary way to communicate. After all, if you think about it, any alphabet is just a collection of shapes, right? You got pointing shapes that tell us things like danger in a visual effect. You've got round and bubbly shapes that tell you things about being more inviting or friendly, and everything in between. So primarily, something to think about with shape is area of effect, right? Shape tells you the boundary of where something is happening. And so when you're making effects, having that in mind is super important and helpful. So let's take a look at the handy-dandy League of Legends visual effects style guide. And looking at this page, basically you can see that in League specifically, we try not to think of shape as like what is the shape of the entire effect painted in this one texture. Instead, what you want to think of it is breaking it into its components, right? So here in this example, we have the flame licks, right? And many of those smaller flame licks would work together to create a larger explosion or a burning fire or something like that, along with other shapes, like shapes of the sparks that are flying out, shapes of the smoke that are going to billow up and plume, and all those things are going to have slightly different shape to them defined in the texture, and then that's going to come together as one big whole. And I'll show you a little bit what I mean later on. So here we have a perfect example of this, where we know that a particle system is composed of many cards that all have their own textures on them, and if we get too much information, too much shape detail into each texture alone, then, like on the example on the left, they all start to fight against each other when they're brought into one big cloud of particles, right? And this is an easy trap to fall into, because when you're painting that texture, you might think, oh, like this nice little reflection of the metal here, and then this cool curve here, and this other jaggedy edge there, and it gets pretty interesting, right? And you're like, oh, and then I want to have like some like lens flare coming off of it, or I don't know, like you're painting in all these different shapes into one texture. But then when you combine those textures with many other textures together to build out the body of the effect, you get kind of a visual clutter, a lot of noise, and no clear shape in the overall effect. Whereas in the example on the right, you can see the different elements, but they kind of work together to create one clear silhouette, one clear driving shape and motion. So kind of keep that in mind as you're building your materials or your textures that you're going to then put on particle cards. Take into consideration how they come together in one kind of symphony of a larger effect versus how cool is this material or texture in isolation. So another thing about shapes is that they tell a story of motion even when they're not moving, right? So over on the left we have a texture again that is trying to just kind of tell a story all on its own, but it's not doing a very good job at it because this is a missile that's supposed to be traveling. And we know that when things travel, they create the illusion of motion blur to the eye, right? The eye kind of just fuzzes together things that are moving along. And in the example on the right, with that texture that we see over here, there's a nice trail coming off of it, so that will feed into the overall shape of the effect in a meaningful way. Even if you were to still frame, you can see that this is traveling this way, whereas this missile here seems to be stationary, but actually it was cast from LeBlanc over here. Alright, so getting into wrangling the shapes. Now in this example, Project Leona is casting this area of effectability that is made of technology magic of some kind, right? So we've got all these shapes flying out. Well, it succeeds at the idea of technology magic flying, but it really fails at clearly defining where that damage is hitting and where it's not hitting. So by wrangling those shapes, bringing them in, toning some of them down, we can get this example on the right, where we still have the interesting shapes that we want of the technology and the circuitry and the magical feeling, all of the same shapes are still there. It's just they're wrangled in. They're toned down to work cohesively in one effect. And this is something that as an effects artist you're going to need to do constantly, right? You're always going to be looking at, okay, I've got this texture plus this one plus this one plus that one, working on these cards and these meshes and everything else. And you're going to get so busy in the tool that sometimes it gets away from you. And this is really a matter of you as the artist saying, nope, I want this shape, I want this overall silhouette, I want this to be sharp here, round there, more prominent over here and less prominent over there. And you really want to control and tune your shapes so that they work together in concert. Especially when you're starting out in effects, it's very easy to let this get away from you. And especially for me, even, like, this still gets away from me, where I love the idea of this shape having its moment, and then this one's cool too, and that one's cool too. But if you let them all ride at the same level of prominence and scale and sharpness and energy, like, they all just kind of bleed together, right? And nothing really works. It's like that previous example and like this example here, where it just gets kind of muddy and unclear. So moving along, if this will load, it's a little choppy here. We have more examples of shapes, and these are all positive examples that we shipped with. I'm not taking the time here to really break down how this could have gone wrong, but you could imagine, I mean, we're seeing in each of these, right, there's various shapes that are all kind of working together. And especially on this example over here, where they're fanning out as they come down, we see that the bigger, simpler, bolder shapes are out at the tip to really clarify that this leading edge down here is where the damage is happening and where you want to get out of the way. And then all of this stuff up here is flavor, and it's using value as well, and also color to tone it down. But the shapes, you'll notice, get a little fuzzier, they get a little blurrier, it's just a little less prominent. And that way you can have the nice complicated circuitry that goes up into here, but still have this nice bold leading edge. And this is a matter of really fine-tuning and balancing your shapes. I know that Mark, who worked on this, he really spent a lot of time tweaking the shapes, balancing them, getting them to work just right for his purposes. And then we're going to talk a little bit about soft and hard shapes, right? I mentioned it in the previous slide, but here we have some awesome effects from the Super Galaxy line. We've got some Super Galaxy Fizz, and I believe an effect from Super Galaxy Shyvana down here. So in these shapes, in these first two examples right here, you'll notice that they use fairly crisp edges with just a little bit of subtle glow around them. And this is great depending on the style that you're going for. It creates a nice sense of sharpness and punchiness to the effect that's happening. But some interesting things can happen too if you blend in sharp and soft. And you'll notice that each of these two over here, these third and fourth ones, they start off really sharp, and then the shapes that come in afterwards are very soft. And this gives you a nice sense of punch and then a dissipation outro. And I mean, you can go ham with this in your materials as well. Like the material could start with really high contrast, and then you can like animate the contrast over time so it becomes more fuzzy, that kind of thing. Could be really cool. And then of course, down here we've got a blend of simultaneous hard and soft shapes going on at the same time, and that gives us this sense of the shapes being really magical and having this nice like glowy quality about them where they're sort of dreamlike or ethereal. And that can work well too. So depending on how you have your goals set up for an effect, you can play around with hard, crisp edges, you can play around with soft edges, and mix them together in interesting ways. Just be conscious of how you're mixing those and which ones are prominent, which ones are secondary. We talked about primary and secondary elements in the previous tutorial. And so yeah, just keep that in mind as you're playing around with those kinds of things. If you want to learn a little bit more about shapes, I previously did a tutorial, I'm going to link that as well, on good versus bad, and this is just according to the idea of making shapes dynamic and having more variety, as the examples on the bottom row show, versus examples that have a lot of sameness to them and repeating things going on. So check that video out if you're interested in diving a little deeper into shape making. Again, want to do a shameless plug for the Real-Time VFX Forum. It's a fantastic place for you to go to get more knowledge if you want to learn about visual effects. Highly recommend hitting up the community of professional and student effects artists that are out there in the world, or just anyone who wants to come creep on us and see what we're up to. And the job board, which I own and operate, that's attached to it. If you're looking for a job in visual effects, it's a great place to start. And I will say, VFX artists are pretty tricky to come by in the industry, so if you're looking to find a place where a lot of us congregate and you want to do some job advertising, I encourage you to go get a post on there. So that's all I got for you guys today. I hope that you enjoyed the tutorial, and I hope you learned something. And until then, until the next video, keep making awesome.